ideas that become solutions to the world's most pressing concerns. Innovation and creativity are the sparks that ignite to transform lives and society, and these need space to grow.
We are home to these creative and innovative sparks. Our work goes beyond the disciplines, across our 9 faculties, 7 campuses, and being one of Africa's top business schools. As an African global university, we stand proudly among the world's top universities. We remain at the forefront of universal discoveries and provide authentically African solutions to the world's greatest challenges and opportunities. We are pioneers in our fields, from the humanities to cutting-edge technologies, continually seeking ways to improve the world around us. Our hybrid learning systems provide quality education that enables graduates to become adaptable game changers. We have molded nearly 500,000 alumni who have made their mark locally and internationally, and we continue to inspire and equip our students to uphold our firmly rooted culture of excellence. At the heart of what we do is our people. They are creative, critical thinkers who can shape society for the better, because that is how we teach, learn, innovate, impact, and live. We are the University of Pretoria.
Esteemed guests, colleagues, alumni associates, and viewers everywhere, very good evening to you, and welcome to tonight's installment of the LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership Conversations series. My name is Sebenzile Nkambule, and I am your moderator for this discussion. Tonight's conversations topic is Beyond 2023, How Current Trends in African Politics Are Reshaping a Continent. Some of the topics we will chat about this evening include multilateral and bilateral strategic partnerships, complicated friendships and international relations, and emerging global order shifts. We'll also talk about conflict, coups, and subversion of democracy on the continent, as well as trends from other African countries' elections that might be seen in South Africa's 2024 election, especially in places that are governed by coalitions. Let me welcome our guests before we jump straight in. First, Professor Derek de Jong, who's sitting to my immediate right, is the founding director of the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute. He also founded the Albert Luthuli Center for Responsible Leadership at the University of Pretoria in 2010. And next to him is Professor Christopher Isike, who is a professor of African politics and international relations in the Department of Political Sciences, the University of Pretoria, and director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at UP. Let me also welcome Professor Nicola Diaga, who is an UP alumnus, PhD in political sciences in 2009, and is the chair and associate professor at the Department of Political Sciences at Stellenbosch University. A very good evening to you all, and thank you for joining us this evening for our discussion. I think we'll have a fascinating conversation this evening. So we start here. So South Africa is preparing to host the Trade and Cooperation Forum in November. Recent developments around South Africa's non-aligned stance in the Russia-Ukraine conflict seem to potentially threaten South Africa's eligibility for the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, as well as its good relations with the United States. So Professor de Jong, let's start with you. And let's talk in particular about the stance that South Africa took, right? The leadership posture led by the President Ramaphosa. Was this the correct stance to take? And what legitimacy, in your view, does South Africa have to have taken the stance of that nature?
Good evening, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Before I start, expressing some ideas on the question, I think it's important just to, for a second, think about the unfolding crisis that we have in Israel and the Gaza at the moment, which is, from a leadership perspective, deeply worrying. And one would only hope to see real leadership emerging in the next couple of weeks. but it's something that I think we are concerned about, and I think from a leadership perspective, we hope to see the kind of leadership emerging that the world really needs. In terms of South Africa's position, so it's always risky for a country that many would argue are morally bankrupt to suddenly come out and lend a hand to others in terms of peaceful negotiations and so forth. So it's slightly risky, I would imagine. Is South Africa the right country to act in such a role? Well, I think if you look at South Africa and you consider any other possible country in the rest of the world, we're probably one of the few, if not the only, that has successfully moved into democracy through a peaceful negotiation process. So from that perspective, I would think, well, definitely we can play a role. We have overcome many atrocities. We have been able over many years to show that our constitution is solid, our judiciary is solid. We stand for freedom, we stand for equality, and we fight all forms of discrimination. So from that perspective, I do think that we can play a role. The question is, should we? Now, if you look at the current unfolding situation in Israel, and for that matter then in the Ukraine, and our potential role in that, I think the question in my mind usually is if there's a coalition of the willing. If there are enough people that agree and would agree on such a peaceful outcome. And in my opinion, I think we're quite far from there. And for South Africa to play a role in that, I would think is probably at this point in time inappropriate. Inappropriate because I think we've got our own problems. We need to discover again our moral path. We need to show leadership in that respect. We need to be able to demonstrate that we care for society and for the common good. We've got some major challenges lying ahead of us. So I think, the old saying of charity begins at home. Let's focus on our own challenges at this point in time, and not taking away the fact that South Africa could potentially, and if you look on paper and what we've achieved over many years in terms of our transition, sure, I think we can play that leadership role. But you know what? We've got more than enough leadership challenges going on in South Africa at this stage that we should actually focus internally before we go externally.
Let me bring in Professor Diaga, and on the same question, right, about the impact that how we posture, how we show up, may potentially have and threaten existing relationships. The USA is an important friend to South Africa, but of course, our non-aligned stance, you could even argue as well, just comments that you're hearing from Durko on the Palestine-Israel situation, we're also not going to be singing from the same hymn book as the US. So how do we make sure that existing relationships are in fact maintained and importantly, strengthened?
Hi, good evening, Sibenzile. Good evening, colleagues. And thanks for having me. It's nice to be back at UP, even if it's just virtually. So just to this, I think I want to speak to, firstly, the skepticism that the US has and others have around our supposed non-aligned / neutral stance in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And firstly, like the ANC government would never use that word. They use more ambiguous terms in terms of the conflict. They would never use the word invasion. So it appears that we're taking a similar stance to other members of BRICS. There is this, and there is an appetite for the fence sitting. But it doesn't look like that's what South Africa is doing in terms of it uses a narrative of non-alignment, but its actions are showing indications of actually siding with Russia. So we see this with the recent staging of the joint naval drills with Russia and China off the South African coast in February. And this year, the timing, unfortunately, has coincided with the anniversary of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. We also see our government speaking about the apportioning of blame for the conflict on NATO's eastward expansion. This is Russian language. And then we also see the recent visits to Moscow by the head of our army. So this has obviously created a distrust of the supposed non-alignment posturing of the ANC government. What are the possible consequences of this for South Africa? And here is the concern, is that it appears that the ANC government is not acting actually in domestic or even public interest. South Africa's economy currently growing at less than 1%. We are facing unemployment levels above 30%. And if we use a larger definition, we're looking at 40%. We have inflation around 7%. So we cannot afford to lose preferential access to certain US markets that we currently have under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is facing congressional debate regarding renewal in 2025. So we stand to lose up to 60 billion per year in exports, and sectors such as the automobile industry would instantly see major further job losses. Of interest, our total trade with Russia in 2022 was $850 million US. We compare this to our total trade with the United States being $23.3 billion US. So we see it also not being guided by human rights, not being guided by democracy or state sovereignty or territorial integrity. So I think one of the things one must ask in this is, what is it being guided by? And it appears to be guided by our history and historical ties between the ANC and its ideological ties with the Soviet Union in the 1960s. So we have a foreign policy based on alliances of more than 5 decades ago, overriding the realities and the priorities of current South Africans. So what can be done, in light of the possible fallout between our two countries? And I think there was of interest, there was a meeting recently, a hearing actually in October at Capitol Hill, where they actually invited as witnesses a journalist, Reddy Tlebe, and Chris Murrelling from Good Governance Africa. They are not members of the South African government. So they were actually trying to get a more on the ground perspective of what's going on. So there's a growth and a growing recognition that internationally and domestically, South Africa is not a failed state, but has a failed government. And we see the US moving away from wanting to work with the ANC as government, but it still wants to work with South Africa. So it seems that the way forward is to interact on the basis of direct interaction with the private sector and direct interaction with civil society and those who are supporting democracy. So we might see the change in relations in that arena.
Thanks, Prof. Professor Isika is still talking about complicated friendships, certainly the one with the US is, but we have other friends. Just a couple of weeks ago, perhaps more than a month now, South Africa hosted what I suppose government would call a very successful BRICS summit in the country, and the key takeaway is the expansion of the BRICS group to now in future to include Saudi Arabia, the likes of Ethiopia, Iran, Argentina, Egypt, the UAE. Should this be welcomed, or what are perhaps some of the dynamics that should be carefully managed in this new configuration?
Well, thank you for having me, and good evening to my panelists and to Nicola in Cape Town, Stellenbosch. Look, let me start by saying that the fact that South Africa is in BRICS can be one indicator of why relations between South Africa and the United States did not completely, turn sour when they had the face-off between, April and till around July or so. So BRICS is South Africa's position in BRICS is very strategic for South Africa for many reasons. But to answer your question more directly, look, the first thing to note there is the fact that the different countries of both the old and the new, if you like, the old and the new BRICS, or the BRICS plus in total, they all have different national interests, right? And of course, also aspirational goals in terms of what they want to see, come out from BRICS. So, for instance, the BRICS was not established when China was getting in there. It didn't see itself as a replacement, or if you like, a challenger of the current world system led by the United States and the West. They saw themselves as providing alternatives, economic and diplomatic platforms, to the one that is being exacted by the Western-led, world order. But Russia, for instance, has a different aspiration for BRICS. Sees BRICS as not just an alternative, but as a challenger. Now, this difference in aspirational goals is something that is a dynamic that needs to be managed. And going from there, we can talk about the differences that exist, between these countries. There's, for example, conflicts between India and China in Southeast Asia. You can also look at the conflict that exists between Iran, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. You come to Africa, Egypt and Ethiopia have not resolved the Nile issue. South Africa is very careful about countries like Nigeria getting into BRICS because there's an unspoken competition between the two. Maybe this is the reason why South Africa was a bit comfortable having Ethiopia and Egypt that has not direct competition to it in any way to be part of BRICS. So these dynamics are there. You also need to look at the fact that these countries are a potpourri of different political systems. Some of them are democracies, and others are they stand in different levels, along the line of what we can call autocratic regimes. But what binds them together really is the economic and the economic factor, the fact that all put together, and this has increased. These countries constitute over 50% of the world's population, and the GDP, if you look at PPP, for instance. So it's an important platform, and I think that once they are able to manage these dynamics, these differences between them, they would be able to go beyond their aspirational goals, even if it is just at the level of just providing alternative platforms. And the question of de-dollarization is one of those issues that must be managed very carefully as well. The BRICS Development Bank till date still trades in the US dollar, holds its reserves in the US dollar, and it's going to be a very important instrument in achieving that. And different countries, and this is part of the different interests that they have, different countries in the BRICS, even though they're in BRICS, want to continue to maintain relationships with the United States. Why? Because their economies and their fortunes are tied to the United States. You can look at South Africa, you can look at even Egypt, you can look at even Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Argentina. These countries are connected to the US in many ways. So being in BRICS is not this or that for them. It's about leveraging opportunities that they can get from being in multiple relationships with multiple powers. It's all about the national interest. After all, the dictum in international relations is no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just the permanent interest. However, we just need to articulate what that interest is and see whether there's a consensus around this for most of the BRICS countries. And that's where I think the challenge is in terms of managing those dynamics.
Talking about other African countries being able to find greater expression, for those in particular who couldn't find a slot in the BRICS formation, might there be an opportunity now that the AU will become a part of the G20? That means they now become the second regional bloc to form part of the G20 after the EU. South Africa, of course, was always a part of the G20. But what opportunity does this offer for these other countries who perhaps have been searching and looking for bigger and larger platforms to find expression for their own interests?
Well, ordinarily, the G20 is a grouping of countries, right? But so the African Union is not a country in itself. It's a union of countries, and of course we know the EU is in the G20. Yes, it does provide that opportunity for these countries that have not been able to find their way into BRICS for now, and the room is open for them, to at least have a say, be part of the not just being the menu, but be on the table itself, to decide what is going to be eaten. And I think that this is one of the unifying force in terms of why these countries are now converging at this point to say, look, we are resisting an international system that has excluded the majority of us and benefited just the minority. So I think that the G20 provides that opportunity for Africa. The real challenge is in terms of articulating a common position, that will help to push its agenda. And this is where I think Africa is not, doing very well. For example, till date, African countries have voted disparately in the United Nations General Assembly. Of course, that drew attention. All this summit diplomacy we've been seeing since 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. Of course, they've been happening before, but we've seen a bit more of them of late. Is because of the way Africa voted. But it is useful for Africa to, at some point, articulate a common position on Ukraine and some of the conflicts that, for instance, Prof. De Jong mentioned earlier, the current one we are seeing in the Gaza Strip.
Thanks for that, Prof. Let's now segue into talking about issues of governance. And when you are looking to craft a common position, issues of governance are raised, Prof. De Jong. Perhaps let's speak about the current state of governance on the continent. How perhaps are some of these failures in governance, in a very material way, contributing to weakening or weak democracies on the continent?
So I had a look quickly this afternoon at the 2022 Human Development Index, HDI results, and there's basically 5 countries, including South Africa, Mauritius being number 1, that seems to be making good strides in terms of human development, which I think is a key outcome of good governance. I think 2 things. First of all, what I would like to call governing rationality. So what is the underlying rationale that supports governance? In other words, what is the broader philosophy? And Isiki was talking about the public good, whether we can, as Africans and as countries in Africa for that matter, be clear about and be very, very specific about the broader common good that we would like to strive for. So, if that is not the underlying rationality, if we think about governance, in other words, how that rationale basically governs our thinking, our decisions within the country and within countries in Africa, and if that doesn't relate to, as I said, common good, I think there's a problem. Now, governance ultimately is government's ability to grow the economy to benefit all citizens. Right. If you don't succeed that, you will be eroding what they call and what we call the social contract. Now, I think with multiple crises that we sit in Africa, and it varies from political instability to broader societal issues, unemployment, conflict, extreme weather events with floodings and so forth. I think the time and droughts, of course, that leads to matters such as refugees, climate change refugees. Yeah. So the whole governance mechanism seems to be under threat by very complex and wicked problems that I think the governing system has not really catered for in the past. But what is important to know is that ultimately it's about growing the economy and making sure that you maintain that social contract. Now, if we think about governance, and more specifically from my perspective, I would like to see governance as just solidly based within the leadership construct. If we have good, solid leadership, then the broader governance would be in place. Now, one can, for a second, reflect back on the King Code of Corporate Governance that was launched in 2016, where the foundational principle of corporate governance, according to King, speaks about ethical leadership. So it's ultimately about ethics and it's about leadership, but it's also about accountability. Now, if you look at ethical leadership, what we aim to achieve through such ethical leadership is to create a culture of ethics, of transparency, of fairness, of justice, and so forth. So those are the key components and key elements that underlines good governance, without which you'll be very thin in maintaining this, what I call then social contract. The other matter that I really worry about quite frequently is the matter of accountability. And more specifically, what I mean with that is a narrow view on accountability vis-a-vis a more broader view of accountability. Now, a narrow view of accountability simply is about self-interest. In other words, to be accountable to be accountable only to those that serves your purpose and that serves your interest. And that is unfortunately something that we see a lot of in leadership across the continent. That dictatorial, authoritarian type style leadership, which ultimately is only about serving my own interest. And that is a very narrow understanding of accountability. The accountability that we would like to look for in the kind of leadership is a much wider, more inclusive way of seeing I am accountable to all citizens if I look at my country, not only to those that will support me in winning the most votes, but really a common understanding and a common good that we need to strive for. So are we having good, solid governance in Africa? I think it's problematic at the moment. I think there's a very narrow understanding of to whom we are accountable to and for what we are accountable for. Our agency is under threat because it's so self-interest driven. And I think the kind of leadership that we need should expand that accountability to include the broader common good. So I think personally, to sum up, governance and good governance relies not anymore on the so-called leader that shouts the loudest. We are in a post-heroic mindset already if we think about leadership. We need to find leadership in places where I think conventionally we are not used to. So what are those places for leadership and where do we find them? And I think leadership lies in collaborations and in collectives. And we'll talk a bit about that later. Mm-hmm. But we are, I think days are numbered to think that the kind of governance we need to maintain that social contract is reliant on individual leaders. It's reliant on much more than just the individuals out there that claim to be the leaders and that claim to be interested in the common good.
Is the willingness there, though, for good governance? I mean, we can measure, whether or not the state is capable to deliver for common good. But is the willingness then? It's harder to measure.
Yeah, the political will, I think, is the big thing, and that's the topic that my colleagues who are political scientists would be much better equipped to answer. But the political will in South Africa is always the case. I mean, we are world-class when it comes to our legislation, our constitution, of course, and our policies and so forth. But when it comes to the execution, it's something else. And what often stands between that, and that's the currency, I would think, in ensuring that political will is trust. Trust is the currency. And without trust, and I think that's the trust deficit that we experience probably is the one thing that stands between us and that will to actually, we've got everything going for us. South Africa's got, I mean, top-class governance principles and practices. It's, when it comes to that when the tacky hits the tar, as they say.
Prof. Diaga, let's come back to you and ask you to focus specifically on Southern Africa, a region or a part of the continent where many people feel failed by democracy or are disappointed by democracy. What are perhaps some of the factors that have resulted in ineffective democracy in Southern Africa?
Thanks, Sibenzile. Well, I'm here in my office at Stellenbosch University, and the Woordfees is going on outside. So I thought it was going to be quiet. So I apologize if I'm competing against a rock band in the background. So I don't know if you can hear it. So my timing was not great.
Just fine.
So back to the question. I think we first need to acknowledge what do citizens of the Southern African states actually want. And there remains strong support for democracy. So I had a look at the latest Afrobarometer survey that was conducted between 2021 and 2023. And of those Southern African countries, it shows that respondents of over 60% indicate that they support democracy. So there is a desire in the region for democracy. Of interest in Zimbabwe, that is as high as 75%, which is quite sad in light of its recent elections. But do the citizens actually perceive that they're getting democracy? And this is measured in terms of the supply, so the extent and the satisfaction. And in this, from the Afrobarometer, we see that only 29% of Southern Africans are satisfied with their democracy. So they seem to want it, but they also recognize that they're not getting it. And why is this? And now I'm going to come to, I'm really going to segue off what Professor de Jong said, because this, I would argue that this is a governance issue. And what is happening is that we are conflating two terms, democracy and governance. And so I think it helps if we can separate these two terms. So if we understand democracy as a regime type, and we understand governance as the exercise of that power. So once you get the power. So democracy speaks to how do you access the power? You access it through elections. So you access political power through elections. You voted on the basis of social support. There are multiple parties that are participating. There are regular elections. There's multiple sources of information. And this obviously differentiates from authoritarian systems where you've got military rule, you've got coups, you've got violence, or monarchical succession. So there are no elections. So when we look at democracy as how is power accessed, and then we differentiate it from once in power, how is it exercised? And this is the governance issue. And so, and this speaks to what Professor de Jong was saying, in whose interests? So you get political power, but in whose interests are you governing? And good governance speaks to you govern on the basis of impartiality. So you don't govern on the basis of personal interests, private interests, party interests. You govern on the basis of broader public interests. When you don't govern on that basis, you create a zero-sum game in politics, because then it's about access to power for myself, or access to power for my personal interests, as opposed to accessing power to represent the broader public. And I think that's something that is going to have to change in Southern Africa. So that's one reason. We see that in South Africa as well, you know, with under the Zuma administration, we see it with the preference given to the private interests of the Gupta family, etc., etc. But there's another reason why democracy seems to fail in Southern Africa. And I think this comes down to the political will that you are asking about, and the leadership. And for many Southern African countries, post-independence and post-democratic transition, there has been no turnover in political power. And there's also been no realistic possibility of that happening. A case being obviously ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. So the incumbent has retained control of executive power since independence and since its democratic elections. And some of the reasons is that it uses its liberation credentials to do so, but some of the other reasons is that it just simply does not want to, or seem to want to, allow for a turnover in power. So it actually actively ensures that opposition parties cannot realistically compete. So in Zimbabwe, we see electoral rule manipulation, we see intimidation, we see violence, we see vote rigging, anything to ensure that the incumbent stays in power. And so this comes partly with the idea of those who have gained power see themselves as the vanguard. They see themselves as having the right to rule and to speak on behalf of everybody and the people. So even we see this in a lack of in responding to public responses. So they say, no, we will speak on your behalf. We will tell you what are your interests. So I think it's multiple factors why democracy is failing. The one is that conflating between the governance and the democracy. And unfortunately, many citizens then think that democracy has failed, as opposed to using the democratic mechanism to punish those who've been in power and to actually get a new party in power. And then the other problem is those who are sitting in power who are not actually allowing for competitive politics, but are seeing themselves as a vanguard party. Thanks.
And we see, Prof. Isika, what the impact of that is. Just yesterday, the Statistician General announcing the numbers of the census of 2022 and showing how Zimbabwe is the highest contributor of people moving from that country into South Africa compared to, you know, people coming from Malawi and elsewhere. It's quite a high number, and that is as a result of what we're seeing happening politically there. But when you compare that to perhaps what we see in West Africa, the sort of responses that you see to people not being pleased by the outcome of elections there, we have seen recent incidents of coups, right? The military getting involved there. So let's speak about why West Africa in particular, as a region on the continent, is seemingly prone to military coups, as we've seen more recently in Niger and in Gabon.
Well, thank you. One simple, straight answer would be that there's been a history of military intervention in politics in West Africa, as you're interested in, and that history is what makes people see the military as an alternative. And when the military grab power, they tend to celebrate, not because maybe they really like the military or trust the military. They celebrate oftentimes because they want to get rid of, failed leadership, failed governance systems, the challenges of electoral democracy, the corruption around it. So in Southern Africa, for example, if government fails, or in South Africa, in Botswana, for instance, the people are not going to look to the military because they don't have a history or experience of the military intervening in politics. They will take matters into their own hands, go to the streets, and bring down a government. So people of West Africa experiencing this coup, on the one hand, because of the fact that there's been a history of that. So the question of why do we have these political instabilities that result in coups? And it comes from the answers that both Professor De Jong and De Jager have given about the failure of governance, the failure of a political system, democracy. But one of the things that research platforms like Afrobarometer have not done is to really begin to explore the relationship between the states and these failures, the conception and understanding of the state and these failures, the relationship between political trust that Professor De Jong was talking about, and people's patriotism to this state. So my theory is that, first of all, the simple answer is in West Africa, there's been, and as you know, all over the continent, there's been governance failures, okay? And in West Africa, there's been coups because we have a history of coups in that region. But overall in the continent, the problems are the same in terms of the purpose of states, the essence of states. Why were these states created? Most of these states were created by the colonialists to be exploitation machines. All right, so by the time African leaders inherited them and took them over, one thing that was not done was to interrogate the purpose of these states. Why were they created? And to ask the question of whether at independence, these states were still fit for purpose, So it's the same thing we're asking about the ANC today, to say, look, if you fought a liberation struggle and you won, should you use the same mentality, a strategy for prosecuting a liberation struggle for a development struggle, the development war? There are two different challenges, and your approach to them must be different. So the approach to the state in Africa in terms of why the state was created needs to be interrogated. We need to rethink our state systems, and it is from that system that it got from a state system that has people involved in it, people trusting it, that you can now begin to talk about what kind of governance systems can we adopt, what kind of democracy. We can then begin to talk about social democracy or liberal democracy, as the case may be. I know Professor De Jager was talking about, democracy as how you access power, but and how you manage power, and that was what she said. The governance part came in, but it's also beyond that. The substance of democracy it goes beyond periodic elections to people participation, to human rights, right? To the rule of law. These are substantive elements of any state system, of any democracy. And until we start understanding that these are part and parcel of a whole state structure, and that when we have a state system where people participate, there is rule of law, people believe that everyone is treated the same and that the benefits are distributed, to everyone equally, then people can trust the system. People can even want to die for that system because they believe that that system works for them. And then we can talk about the kind of political systems that we should have. So the failure of interrogating the state systems, the exploitative state systems that we inherited, which have continued till date, is what explains why our leaders in the continent don't have the political will to do what is right by their people, because their understanding of the state and leadership is for self-aggrandizement. It is not for the development of the common good, of the public good. The minute we have that shift, then you see people who will come to the table to do what is right by the people and what is right by the state. And until we do that, we'll continue to have these challenges, not just in West Africa. We may not have military interventions in Southern Africa, but we could be seeing some constitutional coups in parts of Southern Africa and other parts of the continent. And those constitutional coups are as bad as the military coups themselves.
How much of the blame in terms of stalled progress in West Africa, in terms of democracy in particular, do you lay at the feet of the former colonizers? The French have come under heavy criticism of late, in particular around this time of the coups that we've seen in Gabon and in Niger. But it's also an opportunity for other groups as well to take advantage of this situation. We were speaking about Russia earlier, the Wagner group as well. We're seeing them and their presence on the continent as well. Might perhaps the rejection of the French by some in West Africa bode well for that region?
Well, it may and it may not. But I think that for many people, for many Africans that are celebrating the withdrawal of France from West Africa, for example, it is because the French have continued through a policy of assimilation, continued to control and dominate the economies and politics of these Francophone African countries, and actually strangulated them. We talk about Niger, for example. Why are people happy? Niger produces uranium, right? And that uranium is used to help to produce electricity in France. Meanwhile, that powers more than 60% of the energy sources for France. But the people of Niger, only 30% of them are wired to a national grid, have access to electricity. So that kind of outrageous exploitation is what people are complaining about. So when France leaves, there's going to be a vacuum, and you see people like the Wagner group, now actively affiliated to Russia, trying to fill that void. It's a sign of people desperate for any kind of change. Like we saw when they celebrated in Gabon, they were not celebrating the military, like I said earlier on. They were celebrating freedom from a family that has acted as bad as France has acted, and that's why your question about whether the blame should also not be for us as a continent. So those vacuums are going to be there, right? They will be there. And this is why I talk about the need for Africa to get its act together in terms of articulating itself, its identity, its state system, a governance system, and then around all of this will emerge an interest that is people-oriented and that will make them to talk about how to develop people, how to develop the continent, because it's still the continent of the future in the world today. And we need to get our acts right in terms of making sure that that vacuum that will be created by the departure of France from Francophone Africa, for example, will not be replaced by another parasite of some sort. It will be a new system where Africans can have their destinies in their own hands and begin to become active agents in their own interest in the international system.
Prof. Deja, let me come back to you talking about elections and the electorate, the public having power in their own hands. In South Africa next year, we will have our 7th general elections. And just the other day, the IEC reporting that 17 new parties were registered just over the last 3 months. And they're expecting that there will in fact be more parties that are registered. Of course, not all of them will participate in the general election. But with this trend that we see leading up to general elections in general, what sort of impact might this have on South Africa's political landscape? We always ask who benefits from this when new parties pop up, who perhaps might lose. But is this a good thing for the electorate? Does this offer new options for voters?
I think there are a number of dynamics that we're going to see besides new parties forming. And this is just the nature of the proportional representation electoral system. So we shouldn't be surprised by parties forming and new parties forming because we have the PR system. It allows for the whole point of it was representation and diversity, to bring that diversity in. So it's also a bit of a shortcoming of it because it constantly allows for these smaller parties to arise. But it maybe also speaks to vibrancy and people actually seeing a future in terms of South Africa and competing. But besides these smaller parties and the parties registering, there are other dynamics which I think are going to characterize these 2024 elections. The one which I think is going to be particularly interesting is to see whether the ANC loses its position as a dominant party. And then secondly, we're going to see the coming to the fore of coalitions, and then the introductions as not just new political parties that are forming, but we've just had an amendment to our Electoral Act, and we're going to see the introduction of independents onto the ballot. So these elections are going to be interesting because instead of 2 ballot papers, we're going to be receiving 3 ballot papers. And we're going to see independents coming into the national and the provincial arena. So on the side of the ANC and the evident decline in support, and I think we've each touched on these issues, but there are consequences for poor governance. And these consequences have been declining levels of trust. And we see this in the Afrobarometer, is that South Africans are increasingly distrustful of the ruling party. They're increasingly distrustful of it inside government. And this translated in the 2019 elections, where if we look at not the registered voter turnout, but your voting eligible turnout, population turnout. And by that, I'm referring to citizens who are 18 and above and are eligible to vote. Only 28% in the 2019 elections actually voted for the ANC. Previously, what the ANC has done is that it's actually successfully campaigned against itself. We see just prior to, or the end of Thabo Mbeki, we see the ANC calling itself the new ANC. And then under Ramaphosa, we see the new dawn. But it's unlikely that this kind of campaigning will work into 2024. So we see actually disgruntlement, as I said, that trust declining, but also 83% of South Africans say that South Africa is going in the wrong direction. In terms of the key issues for South Africans, which are crime and unemployment, again, if we look at the Afrobarometer respondents, 89% of the respondents said the government is not handling the economy well, and 88% said it is not handling crime well. So what is happening is that we've got this disconnect between the ruling party and between its citizens. And this speaks a little to that vanguard party and its inability to respond to and to hear the public interest. So the other second, I think, dynamic which is going to come in is the coalition politics. And this is really going to become a real possibility. It's not new to South Africa. We've seen it on the local level. And I think we too often are too concerned about it rather than seeing it as an opportunity. The theoretical and empirical work on coalitions shows that there's something that's important. A coalition works when the motivation for entering a coalition is where there's ideological or at least policy agreement. And then the alliance works towards stability and better governance outcomes. And again, touching on what we've already been speaking on, but when parties move into coalition on the basis of opportunism, again, essentially rent-seeking, position-seeking, looking to access to resources, which is bad governance or poor governance, then those coalitions tend to not work and obviously tend to fail. And then obviously, as I said, the other dynamic, which is going to be interesting, is this introduction of independence. So one of our key issues obviously being an accountability issue. We've got representation, and that's why we have all these parties registering, but our key issue is accountability. But with independence, it actually brings in accountability because you know who you're voting for, you can hold them to account. So I think 2024, we're potentially moving towards competitive elections. And if the South African electorate understand their agency, and this is also what Professor Sike was speaking about, is that we need to move towards recognizing where is our agency? Where is our agency as citizens? And the vote is a massive place of agency, especially if we look in the 2019 elections, where 51% of the voting eligible population didn't turn out to vote. This is a massive opportunity for opposition parties. It's a massive opportunity for the electorate to actually come to the elections and to use that agency that's there before them. So I think these are potentially very exciting elections.
Absolutely. Prof. de Jong, earlier you spoke about trust being an important currency, between political parties or the governing party as well as citizens. But in an era of coalition governments, trust between, otherwise competing or warring parties will be critical here. Is South Africa ready for that?
So I think if you look at the current situation in the city of Tshwane, where we are located with that coalition going on, or attempts for coalition, it probably is a bit of a predictor for what we might experience next year. So yes, of course, trust is crucial. What I think also is crucial is that every member of that coalition representing a political party, or for that matter, an ideology, needs to be intentionally serious about the common good. So coalitions will fail if we focus on self-interest, on domination, on power and control. Coalitions will survive if we are intentional about that common good that we were talking about. And I mean, just imagine the complexity of such a coalition. I often try to place myself in the room of these coalition governments and decisions having to be made. And the ingoing argument often is that we just simply don't trust each other. So having to invest, or we have to invest rather, in a lot of that trust building exercise, which we have left out for way too long in South Africa, to even expect a remote success next year with coalition. So I think it's going to be an interesting game next year, unless if we try with a little bit of luck, to really start focusing on that intentionality that I speak about in terms of building that trust. What is important about coalitions, I think, is the word distributed or shared. So suddenly we share the responsibility. We distribute power. We distribute leadership. And I think that's a kind of an approach or a philosophy that is new. We've done many coalitions and we've got experience in that, but I think we've seen in the past, in the history, that that sharing of responsibility or of leadership is probably the most difficult thing to do, because you would be relinquishing your power and you would be relinquishing your stake in the game, as you say. So as I say, it's going to be interesting next year to see how this whole thing unfolds. What is important also that I've realized in looking at coalitions is, and we haven't really touched on that, but is the whole citizen-led movement. To what extent do we see a build-up from citizens around these issues? And to what extent do we place way too much emphasis on the so-called political party stake in that coalition? So in leadership theory, we see a lot of stronger movements around the role of followers in leadership theory. And if we don't understand followers, I think we will fail to really try and understand even leadership in a coalition environment. So if you take, for example, many years ago, the Treatment Action Campaign. So the Treatment Action Campaign was a movement that stood very strong in terms of the broader objective and what they wanted to achieve. It was in the interest of the common good. And despite the politics of the day and how HIV/AIDS was viewed in the then government administration, the Treatment Action Campaign continued. along their very clear intentional objectives in terms of the common good. So we see an increasing movement of our followership and how followers and a citizen movement probably will enter the game of coalitions as well. We don't really have yet in South Africa experience in that. And we'll need to see how that presents itself in the next couple of months and post-elections next year as well. So, to summarize, I think I don't think we're ready yet. I think we might be missing important opportunities in the next couple of months to go back to the moral path that we've missed. And that's the one thing, hopefully, that political parties will agree on. Whether it'll happen, we don't know, because politics is a messy game, and even coalition politics will be, I think, very similar going into the future. But we'll have to start looking for other forms of leadership constellation. Let's find leadership in processes. Let's find leadership in action, in practice, rather to allow those who shout the loudest to actually win our confidence. I think there are other ways that we will have to find, and we need to educate our electorate also what to look for, because I think unfortunately also, we all have views on leadership from the time that we are born almost, or at primary school. We have an opinion of what is a good leader. I think we are about to change that mindset. And it's not going to be about the euro any longer. We'll have to look for other ways of leadership, specifically in a coalition environment.
Yeah. You speak about active citizenry, which is so important. And it's also important for citizens to find something to unite over. As South Africans, we're a very divided country, but I think we could unite over issues such as whether it's water shedding or the power cuts that we have. But it's finding that leadership within communities as well. Where does that come from? Because to your point earlier, Prof. Isika, you spoke about wherever there is a vacuum, somebody will come in. And we are seeing it with various groups, whether you're talking about immigration and so on. Groups are springing up across the country because there is a vacuum. What might perhaps be an issue or a couple of issues that the whole country can unite around going into 2024?
Well, first of all, we hope the Springboks will win on Sunday evening. Yes. That will hopefully unite the country, at least as a start. It's interesting. Let's for example take the recent cholera outbreak in Hammanskraal outside Pretoria. We didn't really see active citizenry there, which is something about water and contamination of water, which you and I take for granted because we turn the tap and then we're supposed to have that water. But yet, there was no active citizenry. So in a way, it feels as if politics and power keeps that citizenry at bay through promises, perhaps, or through social grants, or through other mechanisms to hold them back. I think the KZN riots recently also is an attempt to actually show that dismay that we find amongst citizens. But if we don't change the control and the use of power, and often the use of promises, which are often, I think, empty by the ruling party or by any other party, because politics is about promises. If we don't change that, I think, and unfortunately our electorate in South Africa often fall for that because there's desperation. So I think we need to do far more and educate is a bit of a patronizing word, but far more to empower people to understand how they can actually make a bigger difference through active citizenry and allow for that platforms and in fact create those platforms. But it's risky for government and for the party in power to create those platforms because it might end up blowing up in your own face. So I think that's, once again, trust, power, these are the big ticket items when it comes to coalition governments and politics.
In a moment, I'll be going to questions from our audience, so please do get them ready. But Prof. Diago, you wanted to jump in on this point about coalitions?
I did, thanks. I actually want to jump in on the point that my colleague made, Professor Jung, about the citizen-led movements and that we might start seeing more of that. And actually, the whole bill around or changing the Electoral Act to include the independents was definitely a citizen-led movement. And it was born out of frustration with political parties and that lack of representation. So already we're starting to see it. And I know they're back in court as well because of a sense of an unfairness in terms of the requirements of independence. So I think we're already starting to see it. I think there are other ones that, which is, I had a look at the census that has just come out today. And again, we remain a very religious society in South Africa. Again, 85% of South Africans identifying as Christians. And yet this is not actually bearing results. We see it with some of the smaller political parties, though Christian, are actually not getting the vote in. And yet here is a key area of unity or agreement. And so it's interesting that's not yet taking traction, but it could still. And we see recently there's, it might be small, but it might be growing, the recent It's Time to Rise movement. And that's definitely Christians coming together in a reconciled way and trying to actually move towards, participation and mobilizing South Africans. So I definitely think there might be something there. So I just want to be in agreement with you.
Thanks, Prof. Professor Sike, perhaps if we could speak also about recent elections on the continent as well, for those who perhaps may feel disappointed about democracy. We'll say, well, look at what happened in Zim. ZANU still made their way. In fact, many people didn't bother to go. Elections in Nigeria as well. You expected perhaps younger people would have had a bold and a stronger say, but that isn't quite reflected in the outcome. I suppose also a mark of maturing or mature democracies is waning, political voter turnout at elections and so on. But the continent can't afford that. But we are still seeing those issues. What can we learn from recent elections? Liberia was going to the polls just the other day as well. What are the sort of trends we're seeing there?
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to just add to the point that Prof. De Jong and De Jager just made about, citizen engagement and movement, to say that the digital era has actually improved, political participation in many ways, and we see young people using that platform and that opportunity to actually becoming more engaged, and we saw how the activism led to political change in Zambia. Where an incumbent was removed, was defeated, and Hichilema now is there. You go to Kenya, you also saw the same kind of citizenship movement looking to get someone like Ruto, who was not the anointed candidate of his own president, win the elections. People expected that in Nigeria, where young people came out, to kind of, in many ways, despite the outcomes, rewrite the political outcomes of elections in the country for many years. So these are trends: the digitalization of politics and the participation of young people, including even young women, getting really actively involved. We've seen that in Zimbabwe as well. We've seen that in Uganda. Of course, there is a response. Corruption fights back. So you've seen the pushback in Zimbabwe. You've seen it in Nigeria as well, the ruling party. It appears that right now the judiciary may be the ones to decide the outcome of that election. And this has an effect on political participation. So you may have people now withdrawing and saying, look, we tried, we came out as expected of us. We're told that we're leaders of today, not tomorrow. We came out and we tried to exercise our agency, but the states used its might, including even the judiciary that's supposed to be having our back to push back against us. But I think that just the mere fact that people realize that they can participate and they can make a difference. They can rewrite the electoral demography. They can rewrite the electoral map. And they've done this even in Nigeria. If you look at areas that there are certain constituencies that were won by the opposition party in Zimbabwe that nobody would have thought they would win, but they won. So these are symptoms of things to come, and I think that they can bode well if the momentum, is sustained. So unfortunately, I think that in Africa we have focused a lot on what we call electoral democracy rather than a substantive democracy, or some people call it procedural democracy. In other words, how do people come into power? If you come into power through an election, automatically we'll say we are democratic. But like I said earlier, it's far, far beyond that. And I go back to the point of the social contract. I think that Africans are now beginning to push for a new deal, a new social contract where people are asking questions around why do we have government? What do they exist for? For who do they exist? And these questions are going to keep on, coming up, and eventually our political elites, and including even us in the academics, would have to confront these questions, and then that is when we can talk about a kind of social contract that people can buy into, be part of, and it is from there that you can, evince what the Germans call constitutional patriotism. You asked the question earlier on about what can South Africans unify around, that can, drive us to where we want to go to. In Germany, they faced the same question after the fall of the Berlin Wall. They discovered that ethnicity was not going to be a rallying point anymore because of what they just went through. And so people like Jürgen Habermas developed what he called constitutional patriotism, where he said, look, the citizens can unite around certain constitutional values, right? Like human rights, like freedom of expression, transparency, honesty, and these kinds of values that everybody across ethnicity, across region would be able to appeal to. So I think that these kinds of constitutional values, we can unite around them, put them in the Constitution, and they become the ideal that we all aspire to. And once we can get that, we'll then be able to hold leaders to account, ask questions, develop the spirit of political inquiry, which has been lacking in the continent in terms of how we have been socialized into thinking that it is wrong for citizens to ask questions about how they are governed.
All right, thank you to all our panelists. I mean, we can keep going, certainly, and thank you for your questions that are coming in. Here's one asking how to control the influx of refugees, both political and economic. I think this entire conversation was, in fact, answering that. But Prof, Isika, just to speak of that, just really the results of poor governance, of political instability, people moving to where they can find jobs and be safe in most cases.
Yes, Mohamed Ayub is a well-known scholar, human security scholar, calls it the exportation of crisis. A crisis is exportable, and crisis in neighboring countries can be exported to a country where there's stability, economic stability, political stability. And I think that this is what we see in the case of, people migrating from Zimbabwe, coming to South Africa to get a better life. And so it raises questions around the quiet diplomacy of the Mbeki era towards Zimbabwe. The question of whether should South Africa have been more hands-on in trying to resolve the political problem in Zimbabwe, not just treating it as Zimbabwe's problem, but understanding that it could also become South Africa's problem at some point. If we talk about controlling the influx of refugees, in the continent, we still have to go back to the governance question, because if different states govern correctly and do what they're supposed to be doing, you will not find people leaving and wanting to leave their countries. But that does not mean that we should also not look at the positives of those kinds of movement, not refugees now. Refugees movements are different, but migration is a natural phenomenon. And there's a big market in Africa now, the African Continental Free Trade Area, that countries like South Africa, because of its developed economy and infrastructure, stand to benefit from more than other countries in the continent. So there's a huge market there. You talked about the G20 earlier on that we just joined. One of the advantages of that is that we're going to be able to access other markets and also allow these markets to access ours. And that can power economic growth in ways that benefits everyone. And we can't talk about movements and of money and infrastructure and the improvement in the economy without also talking about movement of people. So we need to find ways to better manage these migrations, deal with problems at home, but also ensure that there is movement of people to enable us realize the vast economic potential that still exists in the continent.
But Prof. Diogo, it's a leadership question as well, isn't it? On, people move, not everybody is running away from terrible conditions. People are seeking opportunities. How should, whether it's even like, particular sectors or industries, manage this well so that you aren't having locals saying, well, we're not getting hired, everybody else is getting hired, and suddenly that, that group of people becomes the enemy. What sort of leadership could the private sector, say the restaurant industry, for example, that's often blamed for this, that you're hiring Zimbabweans in restaurants, you're leaving out South Africans. What sort of leadership could emerge from there where you are, in fact, benefiting from having, local people working, but also having people from elsewhere being able to find work in these sectors?
I think the answer probably lies more in what government and business should do together, and how government should work closer with the private sector, which I think South Africa, it happens in South Africa. There's a variety of business platforms that engages often with government. The thing is, going back to the social contract, if governments don't succeed, and it basically includes South Africa, if governments don't succeed in maintaining that social contract, in other words, to grow the economy for everybody's benefit, then automatically you open up yourself, for these kind of emerging, issues around appointing people from other countries and so on. So I think, once again, it goes back to what are we doing to ensure that we maintain a solid economic growth path so that we get the kind of opportunities to South Africans. But then it should be if we succeed in that, then it should be a competitive landscape.
Yeah.
So then it must be, the best person for the job. And then whether you come from Zimbabwe or wherever else, in my opinion, becomes less important, on condition that we've done what we should be doing as a government to grow the economy and to enable, well, not enable, but to create more jobs and so on and so forth. So if the social contract is weak, this would happen.
Here's a question, Prof. Diogo, I'll pose to you. One of our audience members asks, what is more likely to be the result of coalitions of parties from not only different but diametrically opposed ideologies? Is it progress or stagnation?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it goes back to what I said, and actually, there is research on this in terms of what makes a coalition successful and what makes it unsuccessful. And there seems to be consensus that it's successful when there is agreement. So there must be some kind of ideological and policy agreement between those inside of a coalition. And when there isn't that agreement, it does create instability. So I think political parties have to also be careful that they don't sell their souls. When they go into coalitions, it's not about, again, then your motivation is about resources and about positions. And at that point, you need to say, okay, what do we actually stand for? Who voted for us? And on what basis did they vote for us? What are our values? What is the intellectual framework or the ideology that underpins us? does, and what did the electorate vote for? Do they vote for that? So not to compromise. And when political parties begin to compromise on core values, like this, their soul, then I think you're going to lead to instability, because it's going to be about a fight for resources and positions, and not about pulling together in the direction of a policy or a change and working together. So yes, I agree. Obviously, there's potential on both sides with regards to coalitions. Can I just quickly touch on what was spoken about earlier? And I think one of the things is that we in terms of, stimulating the economy, our president actually recently recognized, and it was quite a bold step, that the private sector creates employment. And I think while we need to reconsider what is the role of the state, and too often we expect the state to create the jobs. It creates an enabling environment, but we need to actually free the private sector to do what it does, and that we need to free the entrepreneur inside of South Africa to create that employment. And once that starts to happen, once we grow the economy, once we are allowing the entrepreneurs to create the wealth that they are so good at doing, I think with that tension with refugees will actually dissipate, because there will be enough jobs to go around. So I just wanted to add that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Did you want to?
Yeah, just to add a point about what she was talking about just now, is something called, in Africa, Afri-capitalism. A group of people have been researching the need for African entrepreneurs, African business people to work intentionally with government, and put the interest of the country and the continent at heart, in terms of what they do. So seeing themselves as partners with government and having that responsibility just like government itself. Because remember also, when we talk about corruption, we automatically just look to government, but there's a lot of corruption too in the private sector that we've not really studied. And every time it comes out, we talk about collusion instead of corruption. So Afri-capitalism is a concept that has been developed that talks about how the business world in the continent can be very intentional with working with government, not working against government, not taking profits out of the continent and taking it to safe havens in Europe and America, but reinvesting into the continent and deliberately working with government to create jobs, expand the economy, and in so doing, it becomes a win-win for everyone. So I think that's a very good approach that not just government should take, but that the business world has a responsibility, to try and ensure that they cultivate that partnership with government. Because at the end of the day, government is also very important in trying to drive economic growth, but the drivers themselves would be the private sector. But it has to be in a partnership that is well understood by, both parties.
And perhaps if you could add to this question asked, someone asks here, I've heard the professor talk about accountability. How can we increase the rate of accountable leaders in Africa? And it's supposed to expand on it both in the public and private sector, to your point now.
Yeah, so we don't have accountable leaders, because our leaders have never been socialized into being accountable. Like I said before, and I've said this many times, and I'll keep saying it very deliberately, because I think that we need to hear it to a point where we say, okay, what is he talking about, really? The fact that we do not have we did not inherit accountable states. And so you cannot give what you do not have. We do not have the accountability as an ethos. How many times, imagine, let me just ask this question. What would South Africa have been like if every month President Ramaphosa came out on national TV to speak to South Africans about where we are with governments today? And he did that every month for 4 years. I promise you, even when Palapala came, there will be people who will be willing to overlook that, because he was communicating. So political communication is one of the areas where our governments have not done very well in terms of just leveling with people, communicating with them.
But he should take questions as well, right?
Exactly.
Not just speak at us,
yes, of course.
Yes.
The greatest president in the US ever had, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a wartime president, the only one to stay 3 terms, did exactly that. Of course, it was during the war then, but every every evening at 7 p.m., he gave a broadcast to the people to tell them where they were. So these kinds of engagement with people is something that we should start inculcating. And I dare say that the problem doesn't lie with the state alone or with society. It's also with universities in terms of what kind of content, what kind of political science do we teach? How have we imbibed these kinds of ethos into our content and the students, so that when they leave, they understand the importance of being accountable, of being responsible, wherever they find themselves. And, because it's not just only being in government. Everywhere you are, as a citizen of a country, you have a responsibility to do the right thing. And if everyone is accountable, we develop it over time, because at the end of the day, the same government we criticize actually comes from us. So that's where the problem starts, from society. So if there is a problem of accountability in government, it's also because of the lack of accountability in society. So we need to start finding ways to bring back these kinds of ethos into what we do. But I still go back to the question of, it comes down to the social contract. This is what we have not crafted properly. The minute we can get a social contract where everyone believes that we were part of crafting this social contract, and we now have a state system that we feel is accountable, and whenever anyone breaches that social contract, we see the state actively enabling rule of law to make everybody equal before the law. People would start trusting the system. More ideas will come in, and we can come together as a people to solve these wicked, complex problems that defy us.
Prof, yeah?
So how do you get leaders in Africa to be more accountable? You need to hold them accountable. So there's a counter argument to that. There's a very active point that I think citizens need to take. We spoke about the citizen movement, and Professor De Jager spoke about that also. And the fact that we see already signs of that, and we will see that next year with smaller parties that will enter the space, which shows, through coalition governments in these small, in a way, there's a maturing almost of democracy that happens. And I think as democracy matures, that governance is something that will be passed on to citizens, I would hope and I would believe. So citizens would feel more empowered to actually hold governments accountable. So I think that's going to be an interesting space in the future, through coalition governments, through maturing of the democracy, through citizen movements, to actually have a bigger impact on holding governments and leaders accountable than what we allowed them to go free up till now.
We have a couple of comments as well. Here's one. It says, it's heartbreaking that today's South Africa is not the South Africa that we all believed in the Mandela Rainbow Nation days, and politics has done nothing to unify and address the many people who are capable of making a positive difference. Here's another. 2024 is definitely going to be South Africa's 1994. Trust has been broken between the leading party and the people. It will be interesting to see how this dynamic plays out. One more says here, a suggestion is also to educate the masses in the rural areas, as they still believe in the so-called liberating parties, mainly because of lack of changes in the political space. Perhaps let me now just ask our panelists just 30 seconds of a parting shot. Prof. De Jager, I'll start with you, particularly with that last point. The first thought, just reading that, was the importance of public interest media, right? This is, people will argue that the NC is increasingly becoming a rural party. How do you make sure that people remain informed and know what their options are? Just as a parting shot from you, and I'll ask our other panelists to also offer their parting shot.
Thanks very much, and thanks everyone. I think I just want to actually just touch on something that we also spoke about earlier around the citizen-led movements, because part of this is that there's also a citizen responsibility. So it's yes, there's state responsibility and there's state accountability, but there's citizen responsibility as well to be informed. And I actually want to kind of just punt a little bit of what some of our students are doing in this regard. There's an app, I think it's called Yo Vote, and where they actually, you go onto it and you put in what are your interests, and then it actually aligns you with a political party that you could potentially vote for. So that it's providing that interest for voters, but also showing them that there are parties that might represent your interests. So these are some of the movements that are happening, grassroots movements, which are very exciting. Other ones are My Vote Counts, Pledge to Vote. There are grassroots movements that are happening, and I think much of this comes out of a rather dark time in our history, the 9 years of our so-called 9 wasted years, where we started to see civil society filling that gap, coming in and filling the gap. So I think it's that reminder that we have agency, but citizens also have to take responsibility for their country.
Thanks, Prof. Diaga. Prof. Isike, parting shot?
Well, for me, is to say that the digital era has kind of helped to decentralize political participation in the continent, and anyone who ignores that ignores it at their own peril. So if more and more young people, male and female, are getting interested in politics and getting involved, they are taking back their power, their sovereignty. We must get to a point where we begin to try and move away from our traditional understanding of governance, as always top bottom, as the leader who has all the answers approach. We need to start understanding that solutions are going to come from different levels of society, and citizens, Africans, no matter how we want to classify them as not educated, even people in the rural areas have agency, they have intelligence, they have something to offer. So the more leaders start rethinking governance, someone called it governance 401, where there is collaboration, where there is engagement, where there is recognition of agency at different levels. The more we get to that level of governance, the better for everyone, including even the governors themselves.
Prof. Dio?
So just connecting on to what Prof. Isike was saying, I think often we expect way too much from leaders. I think we should find the leader in all of us. It's something that we all have. I think to actively pursue a society where we all feel empowered to actually make a contribution, how small or big it might be, then we'll stop wanting to get those answers from the leaders who are fallible. And I think it lies within each and every one of us. Thanks.
Fantastic way to end what has certainly been a riveting discussion. Thank you to all of our panelists for their time this evening, and thank you to you for watching online and for joining the conversation. Do, of course, look out and watch our UP social media accounts, as well as your email inbox for updates on when the LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership Conversations will resume in 2024. Today's event was brought to you by the University of Pretoria's Alumni Relations team. Thank you for your time. I am Sebenzile Nkambule. Good evening.